thank you very much for talking.
Thank you for the invitation. My name is Jonathan Barnes. I'm Principal Analyst for Copper with Roskill, which is now Wood Mackenzie Business, and I'm in transition to the Wood Mackenzie Copper team. I've spent around 30 years trying to puzzle out what's going on in the copper market with Crew, Wood Mackenzie, Roskill, and as an independent. And what we really find is that it's very difficult to piece together what's really happening in this 30 million ton market. Every time we think we know exactly what's going on, no doubt something will change. So I've got a few slides here that encompass both copper demand and copper supply. My main speciality is looking at the demand side of the market and scrap, but my colleagues have prepared some slides on the supply side. And there'll be plenty of time at the end for any questions you may have, either on the slides or anything that's not covered. Anything you want to ask, I'll do my best to answer. And if I can't answer it, I'll get one of my colleagues to provide you with an answer offline. Okay, so let's begin. So I'm going to begin by looking at the copper demand outlook, where we are currently, and look at the big picture. Well, if we begin with the chart on the left, the light blue line there is the year-to-year change in refined copper demand at a global level. The dark blue line is the year-on-year change in global IP. You can see there's a fairly strong correlation between the two. And it's interesting that really last year, I think when COVID began, in March, we were thinking, this is looking terrible. What's really going to be the outlook, for demand this year? And at that time, we were really very pessimistic. But I think by May and June, we could really see that things weren't going in as badly as we thought. The price recovery kicked in quite quickly. And really the surprising thing is that when we look at global refined consumption for last year, I mean, there's still a little bit of ambiguity about the final outcome, but it's our opinion that refined consumption only fell by about 0.6% last year at a global level, which, when you consider the external environment, is really a very small decrease. Now, of course, the first question that really arises is, well, we've all seen the impact of COVID. We saw the impact on a number of end-use sectors. Why is the absolute decline so minimal? Well, part of the answer there is really at the bottom, the dark blue bar, which is China. And you can really see in the case of China, there was more or less no impact on copper demand from COVID. Few reasons for that. Firstly, obviously, China got through COVID first. Its economy was stimulated by the government. It saw a strong sequential recovery through Q2, Q3, Q4. Also, the stimulus came in the power sector, which of course is very copper intensive. So copper use was strongly stimulated. There was also the situation that China had enacted quotas on the import of scrap into China, which it maintained throughout most of 2020. And what this meant is that as the Chinese economy recovered, they couldn't import units of scrap, so they actually imported extra units of refined metal to replace the scrap units that they were missing. So part of the explanation is you have a cathode replacing scrap element to Chinese demand. It wasn't just present in China, it was present in other markets as well, because scrap supply was one of the most restricted areas from COVID. And the last thing that was going on in China is that well before anyone had even heard of COVID, the Chinese semis industry was already made the decision to invest very heavily in new wire rod capacity. Now, these projects were being built, COVID came along, but as they got through COVID, they continued and opened up these new, very large-scale wire rod plants that they then commissioned. So you also have these structural changes going along, as well as the economic effect. But as you can see, demand outside China was affected more severely in Europe, Asia, ex-China, and also North America to some degree as well. What we've really seen and what we expect to see over the next few years is continued strong recovery in refined consumption. Now, I'd like to put a little bit more detail on that. So if we just look at the consumption wheel, this copper consumption radar, it is very much a simplification of reality, but what we're doing here is plotting the 25 leading consuming national markets on this wheel, and we're trying to allocate them between 6 main segments as to how well copper demand is currently performing. If we begin at the top, this is really demand is peaking. Demand is very strong currently, you know, at this point in time, at the end of the third quarter of 2021. If we move around in a clockwise direction, you can see demand falling, demand slumping, demand bottoming, then demand stabilizing, and demand rising. So in the case of China and Taiwan, obviously very strong performance last year. So what we've seen in China this year is that although Q1 was very strong, the momentum really diminished quite quickly in Q2 and Q3. And now, as a result of some power cutbacks in many provinces entering the fourth quarter, there's a danger that wire rod output will be affected. So really, in the case of China and Taiwan, we can really say that they're now through the peak, and we're now seeing some modest contraction in demand. Saudi Arabia and Brazil, well, Brazil really got hit very hard from COVID. It's going to be many years, we think, to recover back to pre-COVID consumption levels, and Brazil continues to be one of the national markets that's most negatively impacted by COVID and the economic consequences. At the bottom, Russia, India, really sort of seeing sort of stable or stagnating demand, but we are seeing stabilization when we look at Japan. Good recovery there in the brass mill side of things, wire and cable not doing so well, and some of these ASEAN economies and some of the Europeans. Now, in the rising segment, we're seeing healthy recovery really in many European economies led by Germany, Poland, Sweden, also Mexico, Vietnam, and the UAE. But really the strongest areas for copper demand at the moment are really Canada and the USA particularly, and then Korea and Italy and Turkey within Europe. So that's really an overall view of where we are right now. So really quite varied performance by geography, but I think it's encouraging that we've got a significant number of countries now, either where we've got demand rising or demand peaking, and a few more where we've got demand stabilizing, and hopefully we'll be moving into the demand rising segment. So when we try to piece together what we see as the outlook for total copper consumption, so that's refined demand plus direct use scrap, we really see the rebound in 2021 is largely now in the hands of the mature economies. For the year as a whole, we think there will be a modest increase still in Chinese demand, but I think we'll have to wait how the fourth quarter develops. And an additional contribution from emerging Asia and other economies. So really quite a significant bounce back, a very strong bounce back, and then growth moderating over the next 5 years. As I've already mentioned, in terms of the 2020 downturn, you can see a much steeper reduction in total consumption, and that's really because of the absence of scrap last year. But in 2021, you can see a much faster recovery in total consumption than in refined consumption. You can have much greater availability of scrap this year, both for fabricators and smelters and refiners. So actually scrap is taking back the share that it lost last year. So that's perhaps part of the reason why we're seeing less strong growth in refined consumption this year, and partly why after the price peak in May, that really there hasn't been this follow through momentum in the copper price, because scrap is now fulfilling a lot of that incremental addition to demand, and we're not seeing the tightness in the cathode market that we saw in the first half of the year. Now, substitution is an ever-present part of the market. What you can see there in the left-hand chart is a simple comparison in nominal terms between aluminium, light blue on the bottom, and copper, dark blue on the top. And it's very clear that obviously aluminium tends to be sort of a low, more stable price, less volatile. Copper obviously a bit more erratic. Now, if we go over to the right-hand chart, the light blue line at the bottom is the simple price ratio between copper and aluminium. So literally the copper price in nominal terms divided by the aluminium price in nominal terms. So it gives you a price ratio typically is somewhere around 3 to 4. But it's not as simple as that, because in either electrical conductivity terms or heat transfer terms, a ton of aluminium is not the same as a ton of copper. Copper is, of course, 3.3 times as dense as aluminium, but aluminium is only 61% as electrically conductive, or 59% as effective as a heat transfer mechanism. So what you really have to do is effectively double the simple price ratio to get an equivalent price ratio, either for electrical conductivity or heat transfer purposes. So if you thought the substitution problem was a worry at a price ratio of between 3 and 4 to 1, I'm really telling you, you need to look at it in terms of between 7 to 8 to 1 if you're looking at it as an engineer, either for electrical applications or heat transfer applications. And that's why we've seen some worrying indications coming out of Japan. Daikin, a major air conditioner manufacturer, announced they were going to replace half of the copper they use in air conditioners with aluminium by 2024. Of course, copper industry's concern is that if this was repeated by the entire HVAC applications, that this could see a significant loss in refined copper demand. So the battle between copper and aluminium is always being fought out. There's most pressure, we would conclude, in traditional applications. So that would really be either in plumbing tube or copper telecom cable or brass rod. These are these emerging concerns in industrial tube for air conditioning equipment. And there's also a longer term threat in copper's core electrical applications. And really the main enabler of that is going to be rising availability of aluminium wire rod. Now move on to the copper mine supply outlook. So something my colleagues really keep a very close track on over the years is what we're really calling disruptions to mine supply. And this really gives you the annual volume of those over the past decade or more, shown on the y-axis scale. And then at the top, we've got the losses expressed as a percentage of originally planned supply. Now you can see that there's some variation in there, but more or less over the last decade, it's typically averaged around 5% disruption. As you can see, there's many reasons for that: pit wall failures, strikes, technical, slow ramp ups, weather, grades, other, and of course, most recently, COVID-19 disruptions. Well, where are we right now? Well, as of August, we're about 2.4% disruption. And my colleagues feel, we're more or less online or on schedule for achieving around this 5% typical loss. Of course, if it's a bit less, then there'll be a bit more additional concentrate supplied for the market. So although the COVID stresses to primary production are less now, disruption is still going to remain a factor, still something that's going to need to focus on. Of course, disruption's not always to mine supply. We've heard just this week that Kennecott has to declare force majeure at its smelter in North America because of equipment failure. It's unclear how long that will last. So we can see that, you know, the disruptions are there. It may be mine supply, it may be smelters, maybe refineries, but there's always going to be these challenges to maintaining a stable and secure supply pipeline. Turning now to Africa, we're particularly obviously a main focus of your interest. As you well know, African mine supply is dominated significantly by DRC and Zambia. In the right-hand chart, you can see mine supply in metric million tons of copper, DRC in light blue on the bottom, Zambia in dark blue in the middle, and then the rest of Africa in green on the top. What we really saw through 2015 to 2017 is really that mine supply was standing still. Obviously, a number of issues, lower prices, issues in both Zambia and DRC. But what we've really seen from 2018 onwards is a significant improvement in mine production. And this is really quite at odds with what we've seen in South America. There's really been quite a struggle in Peru, Chile, due to COVID, weather, many other reasons. And so really Africa is leading the charge, the fight back in increasing copper production that really hasn't been that possible in other geographies. And really, as we come to talk about the energy transition over the next couple of decades, it's clear that Africa's copper is going to be vital for helping the world achieve this. So actually, Africa's contribution in terms of supply will be absolutely vital for the rest of the world. So you've seen here, looking at mine supply in the light blue on the left, dark blue is refined production. So approximately 2/3 of mine supply goes through smelters and refineries within Africa. And obviously the remainder is exported either as concentrate or anode and blister. In terms of copper concentrate export, the pie on the top on the right-hand side, you can really see there that the majority is going to Asia, predominantly China. Europe is a much smaller share and the rest of the world is even smaller. So it's really African exports of concentrate are really fueling the Asian smelters. We see a slightly different picture when we look at African exports of refined copper. Once again, clearly Africa is the dominant share, accounting for around 2/3 of the total. Europe is significant, probably less than around a quarter, but also significant copper going to feed the copper rod mill industry in the Middle East, which is mainly centered around the UAE, but also to a limited extent in Iran and also Saudi Arabia. What do we have to look forward to in the future? Well, a number of either projects that have come to fruition, which are the light blue ones there. So obviously foremost amongst these, Kamoa-Kakula. Then we have those that are in construction in dark blue. So Kamoa-Kakula phase 2, Tenke, Mutanga restart. And then we have some of these other more possible projects a little bit further out, Kanchansi there. So there are, the project pipeline is there. I mean, it's clear that this copper will be needed. In many ways, when I look at it from my hat as mainly looking at it from a consumption perspective, it's hard for me to see the ceiling on the need for additional copper, either from electric vehicles in terms of the batteries, or wind power in terms of the cables that for the arrays or within the turbines, or for interconnector power grid cables, mainly under the ocean between different countries' power grids. So really, when I look at the future, the problem is not my demand aspirations. I think my demand aspirations are really going to be fundamentally limited by the ability of both primary mine production and the ability to generate additional units from the recovery of copper scrap. Copper scrap is, of course, a significant proportion of the market, at least 1/3 of the total. And given the challenges that we're all quite aware of for increasing primary mine production, we really, when we look to the future, we really think that scrap is going to have to be a bigger share of the future. It's going to have to do more, and we may well need additional legislative effort to make sure that copper scrap can fulfill its role in the circular economy and provide additional units that primary mine production might struggle to supply in the initial outlook. That's really the end of my presentation. Happy to now take any questions that you may have, either about the slides or anything else that you'd like to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jon. That was fascinating. I'll open the floor to questions now. I'll start with one myself. The importance of the scrap market. Anybody living in South Africa knows we have a lot of problems here with hijacked cables and telephone lines and you name it. Do you have a sense or a feeling for what the size of the illicit scrap market is?
I wish I knew, but it's when I get my news feed stories every morning, it's almost, I can bet that half of the stories about copper wire will be about copper wire theft. And I can tell you a story from my own personal experience. This was a decade ago. I used to live not far from here. And one morning in the village, we had no, the telephones were cut off. When we drove up the road, we could see that the village's copper telecom cable had been ripped out of the underground conduits. It had been sawn up with an angle grinder and stuck in the back of a 4x4, driven away to no doubt some scrapyard who was willing to turn a blind eye, take those copper cables. Within a couple of weeks, the copper cables had been replaced, telephone lines were restored, but the thieves loved the copper so much they came back and stole it all over again. So these problems with theft, be it from construction sites, from air conditioners installed, copper roofs that go missing, cables from the railways, it's an endemic problem. I think the scrap industry has been forced by governments to change the way it operates. Now, if you take scrap to a scrapyard, which I occasionally do, you have to show your passport so that your deliveries of scrap can be ID'd. So yes, I believe it is a significant problem. It's the problems in South Africa are well noted, but believe me, you are by no means alone. These problems are endemic, and I really don't see a solution for them. That's part of the problem. You know, you have cables that are recycled before they're really at their end of life. So yes, that's great for additional supply, but not really in the copper industry's good interest to see these endemic problems with theft, because theft means that, okay, do we want to replace this with copper? No, maybe we'll replace it with aluminium. Maybe we'll replace it with copper-clad aluminium instead. So there is these theft issues do come at a problem.
That's fascinating stuff. I'll open the floor to any other questions. Questions, comments? John, it looks like you wowed everybody.
Jonathan.
Linda, go ahead.
First time I am in South Africa, but I'm from Italy. So I was very surprised to see that Italy has a high demand for copper. I didn't expect that. But I was wondering, how can Africa actually benefit more from this market that is actually a high demand? I saw that there is Prisca in South Africa, but there are other potential deposits, and there is Palabora, that is a big copper deposit. Do you have any comment?
Well, I'll firstly address your comment on Italy. I mean, we've really been, I'd say, pleasantly surprised with the rebound in Italy this year. Of course, Italy was, of course, most affected, one of the European countries that was most affected by COVID last year. So it really saw some of its fabricating plants were forced to close due to local movement control orders. So in part, what you're probably seeing is a significant year-on-year bounce, particularly the second quarter when you had very low levels of activity in India. So this year you are seeing this exceptional rebound driven mainly by the wire rod business. Of course, Italy's one of the major manufacturers of winding wire, magnet wire for electric motors, significant producer of power cables through Prysmian and other companies for utilities and wind farms, and a significant producer of brass rod for mainly the fixtures and fittings of plumbing, industrial goods. So we're certainly encouraged to see the rebound in Italy this year. I think, as we're getting towards third quarter and fourth quarter, the year-on-year comparisons are going to shrink dramatically. So you're really seeing Italy look probably the best it's ever going to look at the moment. So turning to your second question, what can Africa do to be a bigger part of the future? It's hard for me to advise, but I think for mining companies, they're desperate for opportunities. We know that the potential for the copper belt is fantastic in terms of the grades that we've seen. Just the headline grades for Kamoa Kakula are just fantastic. They're 7 to 8%. When we look at the world average, it's 0.7. So anything that can be done to, I guess, reduce red tape, speed permitting, clear governance, clear views on royalties, clear views on taxation, stable situations will all encourage new investment. So I think what miners are looking for is certainty. So anything that can be done to provide clear guarantees about certain environments, certain political environments and operating environments, all these things will be exactly what the mining industry wants to hear. And given the clear potential of Africa as a long-term part of the growing supply chains for primary production, all of these things will encourage miners to look again at what they can do in Africa.
Yeah, I understand. I see. Thank you.
We've got some background static there.
Are there any more questions?
Anything from anybody else? Nolene, do you have any comments to make? I got a thumbs up from Nolene. So with that, I guess we can conclude. John, thank you very much. It's a fascinating look in these fascinating times. at a commodity of key importance worldwide, and I think it will continue to be of key importance. Some interesting things came out of it for me. Thank you very much for agreeing to speak. We will.
Sorry, this is Rob Barnett. Sorry, can I come in with a question?
Yes,
Sorry.
Robert, please.
It was me with the problem, and I had to plug in my microphone. Right, I do apologize for that. Sorry, yes, can I just ask Jonathan, what is Roskill's view going forward for South America? You mentioned it briefly as being fairly static as from the supply point of view, but with the new left-wing government in Peru and the possibility of a left-wing constitution coming in sort of China, does Roskill have a view on likely sort of copper production coming out of South America? Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Well, yes, I mean, if we're looking in the medium term, I mean, it's clear that for a number of the new mine projects that are already being built, obviously those are going to continue. So we're looking at K of Echo coming on stream in the next year or two. That's quite advanced. A number of other projects that are being discussed, but equally, you know, we've heard just in the past week that currently the new government in Peru does not look favorably on Tia Maria as advanced by southern Peru. You have these ongoing issues at MMG with the blockades that are just, it seems that if it's not quite every other week, it certainly feels like that. So there are a number of big issues there. You have the major players such as Freeport, you know, wondering about other expansions in Peru, and really, I think many probably of the major miners are really probably adopting a wait and see attitude for the moment. Certainly, there is the potential for the new political environment to perhaps delay the project pipeline or push it out or extend it. You know, that's not encouraging. We know when we put this against the encouraging demand outlook, we see continuing challenges in Chile, but of course there are new projects there, Chuquicamata underground, QB2, expansions elsewhere, Antofagasta. So, you know, yes, there are new projects coming through, but equally the challenges from grade reduction, the challenges of water availability are substantial. And it's really, when we look at Africa, when we look at South America, you know, we're really looking at, you know, what we've seen with Cobre Panama, can that be repeated? Can we look at production increasing in Argentina? So I think increasingly looking at the future, it's not just as it's been in the past, you know, really just this focus really on Chile and Peru. I think the outlook is really, well, yes, what extra can we get from Chile and Peru? What new projects are there? But increasingly, you know, what might be there in Argentina? What might be there in Panama and other nations within South America, and also Mexico as well. So yes, there is clearly a need at a global level for increased mine production. Certainly, the new Peruvian president with his socialist leanings, the fact that we have the new Chilean constitution coming up later in the year. Yes, these all pose medium-term risks to increasing primary mine production within South America, and these risks don't seem to be going away. But I think the encouraging thing, if we looked at 2021, is that at the start of the year, all those risks were there, but in reality, they haven't really added up to a significant reduction to mine production this year. They've all been there, but they haven't really become realized. A lot of the labor contracts were eventually resolved. A bit of last minute brinkmanship at some of them, but all of the major ones were resolved. We didn't see any significant strikes affecting output.
Okay, thank you for that, John. Before I close the meeting, is there any last comment or queries?
Sorry, can I come in with one more, Craig, if I may?
Yes, right.
Right, yeah.
Go
Thanks
for
very
it.
much for that, Jonathan. Also, in the sort of energy mineral field, things like lithium, so on, there have been reports that there's a decreasing interest from the financial sort of investment world in mining or in projects to sort of develop the minerals concerned. All right, this might be a bit out of your field, but does this hold, or is this being found in copper as well? There's sort of reluctance for investors to get involved in mining because of the environmental, you know, the famous ESG story, that it's actually becoming a problem from a sort of political point of view, if you like, to invest in mining. So yeah, thanks. If you can comment on that, please.
I think the very best projects will always find ready finance. At the moment, the questions are being asked not so much is it a finance issue? It's in part, are the miners prepared to be as aggressive they were in the last cycle, where essentially a few of them got burnt because they invested in projects at the peak of the cycle. They were very expensive, and then prices fell, and you know, a lot of capital was wasted. So this time around, it's clearly the case that miners are being much more careful in terms of the projects that they're looking at, the degree to which they're spending even on exploration. Yes, we've seen, you know, some significant projects go ahead, or brownfield expansions in the case of Codelco, brownfield QB2. But you know, when we look at, if we just take the example of Freeport, the areas where it is pushing ahead, it tends to be in North America, doing SXEW expansions, and not really, you know, the larger expansions that it's done in the past. Obviously, you have you know, projects elsewhere. You know, Freeport looking at whether it should be doing projects in Peru or expansions in Peru. So I think it's unfair to perhaps say that the problem is all with the funding. I think it's a matter of, is the risk appetite there from the miners, as well as is the risk appetite there from the financial community. So I think it's a little of both. But what's certain is that you know, when you look at the calculations, even if you're being conservative about the additional metals that you'll need for battery raw materials for EVs, so whether that's lithium, cobalt, copper, and whether you're for nickel as well, obviously, and when you're looking at wind farms, the additional demand that's going to be there for copper and aluminium, it's clear that if we're going to have a decarbonized world, we need more metals, and therefore we need more mining. So otherwise, you know, we won't be able to get there without additional metals and mining and additional recycling. So if we are really going to square the circle and achieve these ambitious targets that have been set for climate reduction, then these will only be realized by additional mining. So get ready to mine, because these metals are going to be needed